Well, good morning. My name is David Trulio, and it is my privilege to be the president and CEO of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. As we start the program today, I did want to recognize some members of the audience. We'll start with our trustees from the Reagan Foundation's Board of Trustees, Michael Castine, Ben Sutton, and Pete Wilson and his wife, Gail. How about a round of applause for our trustees? And from the Reagan family, President Reagan's granddaughter, Ashley Reagan Dunster, and her husband, Joe Dunster. And also from the Reagan family, we are pleased to have Dennis Revelle, husband of the late Maureen Reagan. We have former congressman from this very district, Elton Gallegly, and his wife, Janice. And we also have with us today Dr. Jeremy Moreland, president of William Woods University. Now, for their generosity in connection with our events this week, special thanks to Ashley Parker Snyder from Fess Parker Wineries, Dan Hill from Mach 1 Air Charters, and Anthony Angelini from the Simi Valley Chamber Tourism Alliance. Let's give a hand to our sponsors. Now, extra special thanks and gratitude for the distinct honor to have 4 World War II veterans and their families with us here today. Now, please hold your applause. All right, let's all just stand and honor them. Now I'm going to share their names, and then we're going to do that all over again. So, Charles Chuck Ullman, Merchant Marines Communications Officer; Elmer Bud Lewis, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Marines; Earl Thomas Gentry, Seaman First Class, U.S. Navy, and Storekeeper Third Class, U.S. Air Force; and Irving Weiss, Radioman Second Class, U.S. Navy. All right, everybody, let's stand up and give them a hand. It is truly wonderful that you are here with us today on this momentous day. Thank you. Now, we are also very grateful to have with us the daughter of the late Private First Class Peter Robert Zanatta of the 37th Engineer Combat Battalion. Now, PFC Zanatta was part of the first assault wave on Omaha Beach. So just think of that, 80 years ago today. His daughter, Lisa Zanatta Henn, wrote President Reagan about her father's experiences on D-Day, and President Reagan quoted her letter so eloquently 40 years ago today. Lisa was with President Reagan in Normandy 40 years ago today, and we are so grateful that she is here with us today here at the Reagan Library. So let's give a hand to Lisa. I would simply add, I would encourage everybody to watch or listen to President Reagan's speech at the Omaha Beach Memorial, and it's just so incredibly powerful, and he quotes rather deeply from the letter that Lisa wrote, and it's just extremely powerful. Now, it is my honor to introduce Mr. Fred Ryan, the chairman of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Now, Fred has served the President and Mrs. Reagan since 1980, in roles including Director of Presidential Appointments and Scheduling in the White House, and as President Reagan's first post-presidency Chief of Staff. Today, in addition to being our board chairman, Fred heads our Center on Civility and Democracy, which support Ronald Reagan's vision of fostering informed patriotism, where Americans can disagree about issues without villainizing each other and can find common ground and trust in our democratic institutions. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Fred Ryan.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you. Well, thank you, Dave. Good morning, everyone. President Reagan began his tribute by saying, quote, "We're here to mark that day in history when the Allied armies joined in battle to reclaim this continent to liberty. For 4 long years, much of Europe had been under a terrible shadow. Free nations had fallen. Jews cried out in the camps. Millions cried out for liberation. Europe was enslaved, and the world prayed for its rescue. Here in Normandy, the rescue began. Here, the Allies stood and fought against tyranny in a giant undertaking unparalleled in human history." Those were the words spoken 40 years ago today by our 40th president as he commemorated the 40th anniversary of D-Day, as he honored the soldiers who led that fight, what he called the boys of Pointe-du-Hoc, the men who took the cliffs, the champions who helped free a continent, and the heroes who helped end a war. We're honored to have you with us today here at the Reagan Presidential Library as we look back 80 years at one of the most consequential moments of the 20th century, which President Reagan marked so brilliantly in Normandy, France in June of 1984. Today is about honoring our past and celebrating the courage of the men who took the cliffs. From their courage, we draw inspiration and a reminder that in the words of President Reagan, democracy is worth dying for because it's the most deeply honorable form of government ever devised by man. Today is also about looking forward. What threats to democracy loom in our time? Does our nation have the strength to keep the peace? Would we have the national courage today to take the cliffs? What warnings should we heed? Not just from President Reagan's words that day, but also from his 8 years as our commander-in-chief. With us today are Reagan officials who were there in France 40 years ago. And with us are veterans who know what it is to risk one's life for our country. And with us are family members of those heroes of D-Day. We're grateful that all of them and that all of you have chosen to join us for this special program. So to begin the program, please stand for the presentation of the colors by the Naval Base of Ventura County, followed by the national anthem sung by Voices of Service and the invocation by Commander Hwang of the U.S. Naval Chaplain Corps.
Can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming? And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that old banner yet wave o'er the land of the free
Please join me in prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for your unwavering faithfulness throughout history, guiding the hands of warriors in their fight for freedom and justice. Today we gather to remember and honor the brave men and women of the D-Day invasion. Lord, as we reflect on their courage and sacrifice, grant us wisdom from their courage and the strength to uphold the values they fought to protect. We are reminded of the countless prayers that rose up to you in those dark days of war. As we commemorate the bravery and sacrifice of those who fought on the shores of Normandy, the words spoken by President Ronald Reagan in his D-Day speech come to mind. We will always remember, we will always be proud, we will always be prepared, so we may always be free. Lord, may these words echo in our hearts today and always. Bless those who sacrifice their lives, exemplifying the greatest love. Fill our hearts with gratitude for our freedoms and guide us to honor their legacy. Bestow upon us peace to heal our hearts, especially those grieving the loss of their loved ones, and guide our steps. May your blessings continue to be upon our veterans and their families, both present and past. And may your divine blessings be upon the United States of America. We pray this in your holy name. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for a wreath laying at the Gold Star Memorial Monument, which includes our World War II veterans. Merchant Marines Communications Officer, Charles Chuck Ullman. Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Marines, Elmer Bud Lewis. Seaman First Class, U.S. Navy, and Storekeeper Third Class, U.S. Air Force, Earl Thomas Gentry. And Radioman Second Class, U.S. Navy, Irving Weiss.
States Coast Guard.
We're always ready for the call. We place our trust in thee. Through surf and storm and howling gale, I shall our purpose be. Semper is our guide, our fame and glory too. To fight, to save or fight and die, I Coast Guard, we are for you.
The United States Space Force.
We're the mighty lots to high, guardians beyond the blue, the invisible front line, we're fighters brave and true, boldly reaching into space. There's no limit to our sky, standing guard both night and day. We're the Space Force from on high.
The United States Air Force.
Off we go into the wild blue yonder, climbing high into the sun. Here they come, zooming to meet our thunder. Out of board, give him the gun, give him the gun. Down we die, starting a flame of thunder. Off we gone, tell them a roar. We live in flame, we're bound in flame. Hey, nothing can stop the U.S. Air Force.
The United States Navy.
Anchors away, my boys, anchors away. Farewell to foreign shores, we sail at break of day. Through our last night on shore, cling to the foe, until we meet once more. Here's wishing you a happy voyage home.
The United States Marine Corps.
From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we will fight our country's battles in the air, on land and sea. First to fight for right and freedom, and to keep our honor clean. We are proud to claim the title of United States Marine.
The United States Army.
March along, sing a song. We're the army of the free. Count the brave, count the true, who have fought to victory. We're the army and proud of our name. We're the army and proudly proclaim. First to fight for the right and to build a nation's might. And the army goes rolling along. Proud of all we have done, fighting till the battle's won. And the army goes rolling along.
Ladies and gentlemen, from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute Board of Trustees, Mr. Ben Sutton.
Please be seated. 5 years ago, my son Trey, who's here with me today, and I were wandering around in awe with a small detail from Robins Air Force Base at Point de Hoc and on Omaha Beach. It gives even more meaning to this incredibly glorious day that we share together in the greatest and freest country in the history of humankind. I'm honored this morning to introduce our first program and start by reminding you that on June 6, 1984, President Reagan delivered not one but two speeches that day. There's the Point de Hoc speech that is so famous, but then there were also the remarks at Omaha Beach. There, he honored those who fought, those who died, and those who returned. I'd like to read a few of the president's words. Some who survived the Battle of June 6, 1944 are here today. Others who hope to return never did. Someday, Liz, I'll go back, said Private First Class Peter Robert Zanatta of the 37th Engineer Combat Battalion and 1st Assault Wave to hit Omaha Beach. I'll go back and I'll see it all again. I'll see the beach, the barricades, the graves. The president continued, those words of Private Zanatta come to us from his daughter, Lisa Zanatta Henn, in a heart-rending story about the event her father spoke of so often. Ladies and gentlemen, Lisa Zanatta Henn was there that day in 1984, keeping a promise she made to her father, and she's with us here today at the Reagan Library. Lisa and family, welcome. Lisa will actually join us on our next panel, along with Jim Kuhn, assistant to the president in the Reagan White House, who was also in Normandy in June of 1984. We also welcome Cameron Toor, a recent veteran of the U.S. Army's elite 75th Ranger Regiment. Cameron can help us understand what it means to be an Army Ranger. And to moderate this conversation on the history of D-Day, we could ask for no one better than presidential historian, best-selling author, and Rice University professor Douglas Brinkley. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Lisa, Jim, Cameron, and Doug. Thank you.
What a remarkable 2 days this has been here at the Reagan Library, and I want to thank Fred Ryan and everybody else here, my friend Joanne Drake. We can't go on forever, but it's been incredible and very moving with all the fine touches. And today we're doing, as you all know, more of a focus on D-Day than the life of Ronald Reagan, but the fact that these two major factors in world history, Reagan and D-Day, are intertwined forever, is something to be honored time and time again. And so I'm going to begin today. I thought we'd, in our conversation, get Lisa Zanatta Henn, who we became friends. I was working on a book called The Boys of Point de Hoc. And when I found your letters and your stories, at the time, how all this evolved, she was working for United Airlines, and her father lived in Idaho. Would tell stories about D-Day. They ended up, Italian background, but she had such a love and admiration for her father, and that's what came across. Tell us about your growing up with your dad. How often did he reflect on being there at Normandy, and how your journey to writing that amazing letter to President Reagan that is in the program booklet, if anybody wants to read it.
I think it was like a Friday night thing after a week of work, and he would come home, and he had half days on Fridays. So it would start with, he would be making the gravy, that's what we called it, the sauce, the spaghetti sauce. And then dinner, and then always after dinner, he'd have like a glass of wine, and my brothers and I would just listen intently, and it started with funny stories of him growing up, but it always ended with D-Day, always. And some of the stories were like funny. I mean, he, sliding down a banister in Belgium, and my brothers and I would laugh and think, hey, our dad was doing that in Europe during the war, until I got older and realized what D-Day really was. And he would tell us the stories of, like in my story, about how he was on the boat waiting to land and how scared he was. He was 19 years old. And to me, 19, you're having children of my own, you're a baby, and you're facing all that. And then his dream he always said, I want to go back, I want to walk along the beach, I want to put flowers on the graves where my guys are. It was just always talked about. And he and my mom were planning that, and then my dad got sick and ended up passing away in 1976. So fast forward a few years, I'd gotten married. I'm sitting thinking, oh my God, my children will never know what a hero he was, what he did, what he fought for, what he believed in. So I just sat down and I wrote the story, and it just was like, I don't know, if he was on one shoulder and God on the other, it just came out. And then when they started publicizing it being the 40th memorial of D-Day, that they were all going to be there because they were in their 60s, these veterans, and they would all be able to travel. And there's these 7 heads of state and all stuff. So I said, well, I'm just going to send my story to the president. I'm just going to send him a letter. And I sent my letter. I sent a cover letter, my story, my dad's 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
And
That's where
you just randomly dropped
Remember,
it?
no internet, no cell phones, no, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's what we used to write letters to the president when you were in school. So okay. So I sent it with the discharge, my dad's discharge papers, a telegram I think my nanny had gotten that my dad had been injured on June 6th, and I just sent the whole packet. And it was a big joke in our family, like, have you heard from the president? Are we gonna go on Air Force One? And then all of a sudden, my mom, because I still work for United, but I was based in Chicago at the time. And so I gave them my mom's address and phone number as a contact, because I didn't know, I was commuting from San Francisco to Chicago, I didn't know where I'd be. And then when my mom is in the office, her office, and someone comes in and says, Peggy, the White House is on the phone? And being from San Francisco, my mom thought it was the White House department store until she got on the phone. And then, that night I called her from O'Hare Airport. I was on my way home. And like I said, no cell phones, big bank of phones. And I'm talking, and she said, and she's crying on the phone. And I'm like, Mom, what's wrong? What's wrong? She goes, the president wants to meet you. And I remember looking at the phone going, the president of the United States wants to meet me? And all the people on the phone banks turned and looked at me. And I'm like, so it just started from that. And then it kept escalating. And it was truly one of the greatest moments. And he was the kindest, sweetest man. And my mother could, when we finally were in Normandy and it all happened, my mom could barely speak. And she was so emotional. It was so comforting. And I remember he turned to my brother, who is really big, and he had on his Secret Service glasses. And he turned to him and said, I could use a guy like you. It was just so personable. It was just lovely.
Had your family been Reaganites or Reagan people?
I think, he was when he was governor of California, yeah, I think, but not really. But we sure turned. But he was just, I can't even begin to tell you how, when you think as a young child, or even, as 28, you think, this is the President of the United States. He's gonna be this big, strong political person. And he wasn't like that at all. He was so sweet and so kind and just so comforting. And I'm just so thankful that he was in office to read this story, or my letter from my heart, because he truly understood the value of a veteran and what they sacrificed to give.
And James Kuhn here was assistant to the president, and he had traveled went to Italy, right, with Rome in 82. Now it's 1984, and we should all maybe remind everybody, 1984, not that long after the Vietnam War, so the Vietnam veterans were getting booed and hissed, not all, but often. And so this was Ronald Reagan not just making D-Day a stake in the ground for American optimism, can-doism, exceptionalism, military excellence, winning of the Cold War, honoring World War II, all of that there. It was a way to tell all veterans, thank you for your service. And out of those speeches we've talked about, Peggy Noonan's, Point to Hawk, and Tony Dolan's, Omaha Beach, and Reagan's presentation, now people all over the country started standing up. Teachers would say, do we have a war veteran, somebody who did service, please stand up. And it really did start a new kind of respect to our veterans. So, Mr. Kuhn, you went then you work with Mike Deaver, and you were doing advanced work. Tell us of how the decision to go to Normandy in 1984 began, and tell us about your travels to set it all up.
You'd mentioned 1982. That was the President and Mrs. Reagan's first trip to, as President, First Lady, obviously, to Europe. And it was after that the dialogue already had started in the White House about going to Normandy in 84, and how important it was going to be, and how meaningful, and it just fits so well with Ronald Reagan, because he understood. He always had the big picture in mind that if you want a strong national economy, you have to have a strong national defense, and if you want a strong national defense, you have to take care of America's veterans, so the planning began, as I said, discussions about what 84 would entail. And Mike Deaver, you had Jim Baker and Ed Meese and Mike Deaver. And Mike oversaw all the travel. He made he presented everything to the President and Mrs. Reagan. And for the 40th anniversary of D-Day, yes, we knew we were going to Omaha Beach. And the Allied leaders, it was already decided we're going to be for a ceremony at Utah Beach, but Deaver understood that this had to go beyond that there would be a third venue, a third stop, a third battlefield where Reagan would speak that day. And there was a lot of discussion that went into Point to Hawk. Do we go there? Do we not? The highest levels at the White House, the National Security Council, State Department, our embassy in Paris, is Point to Hawk the fitting place? And it was decided that it was. And that was after our survey trip 4 months ahead of time over there. And once those decisions are made, assignments are made, and I drew the lead advance for Normandy, for Point to Hawk, for Omaha Beach, for Utah Beach. So you go 4 months ahead of time, you go 2 months ahead of time, and then just under 3 weeks ahead of time, you set up the advance team. And we had a lot of support. We had plenty of White House staff helping us. We had our speechwriters, we had our advancemen, we had our military support, Air Force One, Marine One, the embassy, the State Department. There were a lot of people involved in it. But most importantly were people like Lisa, Zanatta, Henn, and what it came to that day and everything. And our biggest concern was weather and and what it was going to be like trying to get the President and Mrs. Reagan across the English Channel, because they'd been in Ireland making all kinds of news there, and then went into London the night before on June 5th, had dinner with Prime Minister Thatcher, and that next day, midday, we had to get 5 helicopters across the English Channel, and I think everybody knows with the weather, the ceilings, the fog, we had to have a contingency plan to bring Air Force One into Cherbourg. We had to have 2 schedules, and was it going to work? And we had 6 hours to do 3 events. And we used to say Reagan, the Irish Select always kind of prevailed when it came to the weather, because when he showed up so many times it cleared and we had a picturesque day. Some fog came in during the speech, but it was quite a sight to see Marine One and the other 4 helicopters coming across the channel. And the last thing I'll say, Doug, here is that it was all timed for them to land at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in France, and it just so happened to be 7 o'clock on the East Coast, and all the morning news shows took it live, and so we had 6 hours of nonstop events and 2 very historic speeches, and as they say, it was because of people like Lisa and her dad, and of course our veterans, our military, and the President and Mrs. Reagan.
One word about Mike Deaver. I mean, in my field of presidential history, we talk about who are the great speechwriters, and people will talk about Ted Sorensen with Kennedy and Peggy Noonan with Reagan. But in the term stagecraft, Mike Deaver is always the one given as an example, and I noticed how astutely he did set it up for the morning shows, made sure they were running this live right in the morning. Good Morning America, there's the President, and many other things. Just briefly, but what was so special about Deaver? How did he get things done in the way that he did that we see other presidents struggle with, and he seemed to be a maestro?
Well, he knew Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan better than anybody, and he knew their thought process. He knew when to put them out on travel, and of course it was a given they were going to be in Normandy. But a lot of presidents will go here, they'll go there, they'll go everywhere they're invited to. Deaver didn't do that. He didn't recommend that. He knew when they needed to appear and when they didn't. So he knew what Reagan himself wanted. He knew, and Nancy was very much in the middle of everything in that regard, especially as their travel went. But he knew how to put Reagan out there, when to have him appear and when not. And he was just a master at communications. He knew how to market Ronald Reagan. He just did.
Let's bring into the conversation Cameron Toor, 75th Ranger Regiment, U.S. Army retired. Cameron, so you're once a Ranger, always a Ranger, right? But I'm wondering, being a Ranger, different decades mean different things. If you studied this period of, let's say, look at the D-Day, a Ranger on the U.S. Army 2nd Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, June 6, 1944. How did the Rangers start evolving, and what are some of the similarities of Rangers in the 60s and 70s, 80s on down to the Rangers today?
Thank you, and thank you to the Reagan Library for having me out here. As a California resident, seeing a big group of God-fearing Americans get together in California is refreshing. So it's been a good 24 hours, but So, referencing, D-Day Rangers or D-Day soldiers as a whole, and to the men that are sitting right here, the standard was set in World War II, right? So on paper, Rangers go all the way back to the French and Indian War, but the heart of a Ranger was born on D-Day. And I think, every generation to follow has always played this game of trying to live up to that expectation, trying to honor them in a certain kind of way. So, when you go through selection, when you go through the process to become a Ranger, it's not just push-ups and long walks, right? It's a lot of knowledge as well. So they hammer that history into you, and not only the more recent history of Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, but also World War II, right? So D-Day and everything that happened that day. And just, a quick statistic, right, just to really highlight the significance of D-Day. That morning, 2,500 Americans died. The entire 20 years in Afghanistan, 2,400 Americans died. So just in one morning, we lost more Americans than the entire conflict I was a part of. So, when you go into conflict, when you go into war, when you go on a mission, especially nowadays, those statistics are ringing, and we're just doing our best to live up to those men and women, do our best, and continue that level of patriotism that was sparked, during World War II and after World War II. So, I guess to kind of wrap that up, the heart of a Ranger was born, starting on D-Day, and then the events that soon there followed. But it hasn't changed. The Ranger mindset hasn't changed. The technology has changed. The weapons have changed. I was very fortunate to be born when I was born. I had probably $1 million worth of equipment on my body at any given time, where these guys had a canteen of water, a M1 Grand, and 4 or 5 clips of ammunition. So when they're told to storm the beaches, it wasn't if you're gonna make it out, there was a good chance you were dying, right? So it's the fact that you're able to run into that, knowing that death is probably gonna occur, right? If it's not you, it's statistically speaking, it's gonna be the 2 guys next to you. And still, when those ramps drop, they charged those cliffs, they scaled those cliffs. When one guy got shot, another replaced him. And I don't know if any of you guys have done any rock climbing or anything, but climbing while holding a rifle and fighting is not an easy thing. So the odds were stacked against them, and they still pushed through. And I think out of the 250 Rangers specifically that scaled those cliffs, I think about 90 made it out alive. So pretty big loss of life there for the special operations community. I guess a little bit different back then, but it was a massive loss of life. So our job is just to kind of continue and honor what those men did, and try and live up to what they were.
Yeah, and the very term Rangers, we think it's been around, but it wasn't. It really became special ops in World War II, meaning the French and Indian War. There would be Rangers, but those were people protecting a community that would do a wide reconnaissance to make sure the community didn't get sacked. There were Confederate Rangers in the Civil War, and Texas Rangers, not only a baseball team named after them, that was Texas law enforcement. But they were skittish to create the Rangers because we weren't sure we wanted that kind of special ops. Like some of FDR's thinking, and George Marshall, was why do you take the creme de la creme, the best, and pull them and put them all in one group? Like, right. What do you think about that? I mean,
well, so the Rangers really started at World War II, Vietnam. The idea of the Rangers was send the top guys from their unit to training, right? Go to Ranger training, learn everything there, come back to the unit, and it's kind of a train-the-trainer situation, right? So they'd go to their unit, they would do their best to take the knowledge they learned and turn everybody else into Rangers, or at least, better fighters. Later on, SOCOM was developed, and their funding essentially was just different. So special operations as a whole was created. So we have Navy SEALs, AFSOC, MARSOC, Rangers, Green Berets, you name it. But when that was created, it really created this big divide between regular military and special operations. And at that moment, the regular military became more of a hammer, right? A supporting hammer, where special operations became more of a scalpel. So the mission really changed at that point, and we were treated like gold, right? When I made it in, one of the first things they do is they take you to this big warehouse and they say, pick whatever you want, right? So it didn't matter what boots or guns or gear or whatever. I got whatever I wanted, and it's kind of like like a superficial moment, right? I was like, I don't deserve this. Like these guys were fighting with nothing. What it means to be a Ranger is somebody that can go into a war with a canteen of water and a pistol, right? And take over a village or do whatever they need to do. So there's a very, very big difference between modern Rangers and Rangers back then. And obviously the word Ranger stems from ranging, right? So long walks, long movements. We took helicopters everywhere, right? We took Humvees everywhere. We did a lot of walking and training and stuff, and there was a few, missions where our guys were walking pretty far, but we had the Golden Road, So you look back at the history of a Ranger, it was a much, much different game back then.
We should also thank the hero, Colonel Earl Rudder, who, Rudder in World War II, he had the task of telling the U.S. Army 2nd Rangers about 50% of you are, after all this vigorous training in Chattanooga and Fort Walton Beach and Fort Dix, New Jersey, and then going over to Great Britain and training in Wales, climbing up grapnels in secret, all of this going on, and Rudder, that April of 44, told them finally what their mission would be and said, half of you are going to be dead. It's going to be a suicide mission. And it's not, you will be treated like royalty if you quit. Please, you'll go back into the military, and this is not on your record. Nobody can put somebody onto a death mission. And I want to, and none, it's like a moment of the Alamo, the line in the sand, all of them stayed. And Rudder then no officers were allowed to go, and Rudder insisted, and he actually broke military protocol and law. He could have been court-martialed for embedding with the Rangers and going there on Normandy himself, because he couldn't send those. He later went on to become the president of Texas A&M, and actually is the one who integrated women. It made it a co-gender, university, Rudder. And then Dwight D. Eisenhower, who at Ronald Reagan admired just so much, and when we think about what Ike had, to have the letter, if it all went terrible, he'd have to take all the blame, and then of course the letter if it went right. And the last thing with the weather problems, but I don't know if people realize, on the evening of June 5th, they all ate hot dogs, the U.S. Army 2nd Rangers, and they were going to leave at early morning. It was their dinner, beans, hot dogs, and they all got food poisoning from the hot dogs. So there was a lot of vomiting and illness going on, and then they had to get one of those Higgins boats, crammed like sardines with their guns and grenades and pack. And with the navigational blunder, they got off at the wrong spot. And as you said, they'd shoot the grapnel off the Higgins boats, but then you had to crawl straight up, all the way to the top, and just blood. But they took out the French, 155 millimeter blasting guns by taking thermite grenades and dismantling them, and we would have had many more dead if it wasn't for men like Lem Lamel and Jack Kuhn and others, almost all gone. And we're so blessed to have be here today with some D-Day veterans. I was going to go, Lisa, let's switch gears and talk about Ronald Reagan, the father, and how moved he was by the writing you did and just a commitment of her daughter to a father. Did he ever mention anything to that, or have you just intuited it over the years?
No, when we walked, we talked about all the helicopters. We were standing in a place, my family, and the lady was our guide, or said, there's going to be 3 helicopters. The first one will be the president's aides. The second one will be the president's, the press. And then the next one will be the president and Mrs. Reagan. So we're watching all this, and they walk by, and I said to my mom, oh, look how close we are. Because I thought that was it. But then they took us into the room, and he was there, and the first thing he did was grab my hand and say, I'm so proud of you. Your father would be so proud of you. And I needed to hear those words. And I always felt, and he wrote me several times. He wrote me again when he was going to visit Bitburg, the German cemetery. And he wanted to know how my father would feel about that and how I would feel about if he went to, and I said my father would go. They were teenagers as well, doing what they were told to do. So I really kind of had my dad and then kind of this father figure, and he was good.
And did you become a hero in your own family for pulling this off?
Oh, I think to this day they're still shocked that, it's like, I'm still shocked that it happened. And especially with the picture, I think it's in the program of the kiss. So it's like, I have that. The White House sent me that picture. And we had it framed. And people would come in the house and go, is that you? Can you see the president? So yeah, I've gotten a lot of people through history class, a lot of relatives, like I could just mention D-Day. I have information about D-Day, so yeah.
After that experience, being there, did you start reading more about D-Day, learning more about Ronald Reagan?
I kind of read everything. I always read a lot of stuff about World War II. In fact, I'm doing it again and started to read. I reread your book and found out a lot more things that I had, realized I'd forgotten and skipped, so. And yet we just watched. I just always felt, still, like I said today, when I step onto these grounds, there's a comfort here that I feel. And I don't know, it's because we had kind of a bond. I mean, he said goodbye to me in his farewell address. I don't know, he's a good man, good dad.
It holds up, the speeches today when you read them, not just the beauty of the language, or if you watch the beauty of Ronald Reagan's delivery. I think it's one of the classic presidential speeches, period, for what it says about America's commitment to democracy at home and abroad, and the feeling that we liberated half of Europe, but the other half might need to be liberated. And what do you think of the enduring value of Reagan's speech, or speeches, if you like, at Normandy?
When you work at the White House, and you don't realize at the time how historic some things are. Like, it could be a photo, and that photo appears decade after decade after decade. And Reagan's speeches that day, Point to Hawk and Omaha Beach, just are there, and they'll be there almost forever. It's just so impactful, what he said that day, how he moved the nation, how Europe was moved by it, how the media reported it, and those spoken words just continue. I mean, they're just indelible. The words are. They just are. And with regard to the speeches, that when he gave the first speech, Point to Hawk, when you work at the White House, and Fred Ryan knows this, Joanne Drake and Frank Lavin and Charlie Backley, you have the highs and the lows of working at the White House, and it's not all good. And when things were really going well, you're like, you got to come back down to a normal level, and then you got to pick yourself back up when things aren't so good. Reagan was always steady, as I like to say, was always amazing. Steady in the best of times, steady in the worst of times. He knew how to manage his emotions, and whether it was a successful endeavor, could have been legislation, it could have been some failure, whatever, he just moved on. Point to hawk, Reagan was Reagan-esque, very strong. And the veterans are there. There were a lot of tears, and Reagan delivered that historic address, spent time with all of them afterwards, as did Nancy. But when he got to Omaha Beach, it was different. And that was because of Lisa. And I always remember Lisa was there in the front row, and as Reagan spoke, and the emotion she was showing impacted Reagan. And Reagan got through the speech, but he showed a lot of emotion toward the end, and choked up, and but spoke the words. And you never saw that with Reagan, but that day you impacted him like no other human being that I've ever known did or could. And of course, all the media were there. They did the cutaway shots of you. They showed Reagan. But beyond that, one of the things I remember most was Reagan and your dad, Brian Mulroney. They best of friends, great everything. Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, Yazoo Nakasone, but especially your dad and Margaret Thatcher. But then there was Francois Mitterrand of France. And that was a business relationship that they had. It was all business. That's the way it was. But what I remember also that day was Francois Mitterrand was there with Reagan when he spoke at Omaha Beach, as you well know, so many know. And Reagan made reference to President Mitterrand in the speech. But Mitterrand, at the end of the speech, he saw how the emotion that Reagan had shown, and Mitterrand went up and touched Reagan and touched him and actually kind of consoled him in a very nice, warm way. I thought, now I've seen everything. I just cannot believe that Francois Mitterrand went up to Ronald Reagan and did that, And so it was just incredible. And once again, Lisa, because of you.
Oh, you're so sweet. Thank you.
Well, it's
my dad.
The words. Ronald Reagan was an incredible reader and writer, and Governor Pete Wilson helped me once get to edit Ronald Reagan's diaries, and I was amazed at how he thought and put honesty down on paper, but wouldn't swear. If he was going to say a word anything, he'd put dashes, like controlling. Didn't want on writing, but hand did them all. Then we, with Professor Skinner, who's at Pepperdine, got to look at some of his letters Ronald Reagan wrote, which are remarkable. Then you look at the radio scripts, and you could be forgiven in the 80s to think Reagan's saying that Soviet Union's going to collapse and that democracy is going to beat communism and all, and a lot of people thought the Cold War would go on forever. How important do you think in memory the fact that here's 1984, as we heard from Peggy Noonan last night, this pulling together of your father and Thatcher and Pope John Paul II and Chancellor Kohl and the others, this great moment. But by 89, the Berlin Wall's down. And then Reagan had that other great speech about tear down the wall. And then by 91, the Soviet Union collapses. It's almost that Reagan in Europe seems to be going on a roll. Do you think, is it because he understood World War II so well? He had been in the Army Air Corps. He was a writer. He understood film and the visuals of it all. How was Reagan? He got so embraced, like you just said, in Europe, do you feel they were feeling his emotions and his commitment to NATO and the like?
I think so. I think that he really understood sacrifice for these veterans. Even though he hadn't fought, he did a lot for getting people to war bonds and all the films that he did. But I think he really understood what sacrifice was for these families. That he really, I think maybe he wanted to always be a soldier. I always got that feeling that he would have wanted to fight if he could. And because these people were, and it's just an honor, like my dad and the United States, it was an allied force. And I really believe that he saw them all as just heroes. And I think that Europe saw that. I think especially when we were in France, I really felt that especially in the Normandy area, that the American soldier, the Americans were just, they saved us. So I really feel he was able to articulate that and feel it. I think he showed it. I know, people say, oh, well, he was an actor, blah, blah, blah. But I really feel for myself that I saw it. The real deep commitment to democracy, to freedom, what it meant to be those young guys going over to a foreign country and fighting, to bring back the right to be who you wanted to be, the right to vote, whatever. I mean, to fight against a dictator. I think he really, in his heart, felt the extreme importance of democracy.
Nicely said. Thank you. And Cameron, how important do you feel? And I know everybody's an individual, so I don't want to make you spokesperson for the Rangers. But with that said, how important is a commander-in-chief for morale, who is serving as president, when you do all this training? And do you feel that you need to have the confidence of the president, or the president says that we do it, we're not interested in their personalities or policies, we just follow orders?
It's everything, right? So I got to serve under both Obama and Trump, very different experiences. It was there was a lot of support, and the one thing that I got from serving under Trump's administration was, it seemed like that administration was much more willing to ask us what we should do, right? Like, what is the answer to this? What do we need to do? What do the rules of engagement need to look like? And that something as simple as that makes us feel important, right? On top of that, there's always question of why we're doing this, why we're here. I'm sure from World War II to Vietnam, you name any conflict, the individual is going to ask themselves that on both a personal level and then a global level, right? So in Reagan's speech in '84, he has a great piece on liberation versus conquest, right? And that bit alone still rings through the military, right? Because we're over here, we're in this country, we're babies, like you referenced, right? I was 19 years old my first time in Afghanistan, and we don't know what we're doing, right? I learned how to do my laundry when I was in the military for the first time. So, we don't know what we're doing, but if we have a president that can help explain that to us, right? Like, no, you are liberating this country, and we saw that, right? You start working with the Afghan locals and really understanding why we need to be there beyond the greater picture. I mean, they are some of the most hospitable people in the world, and they were under Taliban rule forever. They're living in a prison within their own country. So getting to understand the difference between liberation and conquest is huge, right? And then having the support of an administration behind you, knowing that, hey, we're going out on a really deadly mission, whatever the case may be. We know we have air assets. We know we have QRF. We know we have people that are going to be there if things go wrong here. So I can't say we had that for the prior administration. I can say we had that for Trump's administration, which was a very securing feeling. When you know you have backup, you operate a little bit different. you sleep better at night, you know, knowing that no matter what, you're taken care of. So it's very important. I think it's everything. And to that point, you know, coming back to the States, having the support of the public is huge, right? Vietnam was a terrible example of that, you know, and I think more recently, since, you know, our terrible pullout of Afghanistan in 2021, I've actually seen an increase in support. And people, you know, always ask me like, hey, you know, maybe they're aged out of their ability to join or whatever the case may be, you know, how can I help? How can I support? Are there foundations? You know, what is out there for me to be a part of it? And the best answer I can give is just be a good American, right? And, you know, we go over and we do what we do, right? And everybody's got a different role in this world, but being a great American doesn't just mean flying that flag in your front yard. I'm a strong believer in, you know, this country is ours, it's not the government, and it starts with the individuals, right? So if you want to make a great nation, it starts with a great family, right? So strong fathers, loving mothers, you know, and building strong families that push those good morals and ethics onto their kids. Strong families build strong communities build strong cities to states to nations, right? So, you know, if you guys leave with anything today, you know, it's just be a good American, and that's how you serve your country. And I think if everybody were to do that, we'd be in a much different spot, you know. And it's sad that we've drifted from that.
What did your, this is brilliant. How did you get the idea of being a good American from your parents? Did you have anybody in your family in the military? Teachers? How did your journey take you to the Rangers?
I was very fortunate to have a very strict grandfather that pretty much raised me, right? And I say strict, when you're a kid, it's strict, right? But, you know, as you get older, you realize why it's strict and why that discipline is instilled on you. And, you know, he served in the Korean War. He was in the Army. My uncle was also in the Army. He was Vietnam. He was a long-range reconnaissance guy. It's kind of what segued my career into the Rangers. But, yeah, I was kind of always around it. I grew up on a very patriotic street, I should say, amongst a very blue city. So, yeah, all of the a few of the families on our street were military families.
What's the blue city?
Well, I mean, San Diego. So
Okay.
I should say California as a whole is a blue state, but San Diego is probably a little bit more red there, or just patriotic in general. So, yeah, I always grew up around it, and I would see, you know, especially growing up through the early days of Afghanistan, Iraq, you know, neighbors would leave and parades were thrown for them, and it was just, to a young kid, it's like, those are the superheroes, right? I want, you know, I can't be Superman. You come to terms with the fact you can't be a real superhero, so that's the closest thing you can be. So I'd say it was probably a collection of people, you know, my grandpa, my uncle, and then just kind of the area I grew up in is what, you know, really pushed me into the military.
You were clapping like the whole audience was for your very eloquent you know, recital of what it means to be an American, beautifully said. How did you feel emotionally dealing with, you know, you're setting something up, a speech could go sideways, the weather, as you said, there's not, the satellite feed doesn't work for the show. Did you get a feeling when the sun broke and that things were just falling into place, or did you have a kind of anxiety throughout the process? And did you yourself, how did you encounter that extraordinary cemetery of crosses, you know, Stars of David and crosses, and you go there, and how many in the audience have been to the cemetery at Normandy? That's a good amount. If your hand didn't go up, go. If you can. It's one of the most remarkable places to understand what you're talking about, the cost of freedom and what is liberation and the like. But Tell us a little personal yourself about this.
Well, and picking up on the American Cemetery at Omaha Beach, when you see those 9,387 crosses, it's just an impeccable sight. And it's just breathtaking to see, and you just have to stand there and just in silence and think about where you are, what took place, what they did, and then to go back there like we did day after day, getting ready for the advance operation, but you never lost sight of where you were, what you were doing. But when we put that all together, as I said, we had a lot of support. It was a big advance team, a big operation, and you just knew going in how important it was going to be and how fitting it was for Ronald Reagan to be there that day, and you just kept telling yourself, don't mess this up, you know. And but I want to go back to your question to Lisa, and talking about democracy and democratic values and everything, and the perception of Reagan. Whether the people, countries, leaders in the U.S., anywhere in the world, were in accord with Reagan or not, I think they saw Reagan as a man with a big mind. When he gave those speeches in Normandy that day, that kind of secured his position, so to speak, as a true statesman. And then if you really knew Reagan, aside from that, so I think he had respect at that level. But there were a lot of people, too, in this country and beyond, and especially those that worked for him and really got to know him. You saw the decency of that man and how much he cared. And the ultimate point I want to make here is every decision Reagan ever made was always based on, I think, the human element. You know, it was never as he always said, don't tell me the political upside, don't tell me the political downside. But he truly looked at the human element in any decisions he made, whether it was foreign policy, domestic policy, national security, and he cared that much. And he saw that side, and it was. And I'll use an example. Sanctions came up yesterday, and Reagan was against sanctions, and whether it was South Africa or otherwise, and his veto was overridden of the Anti-Apartheid Act. But he truly believed that those sanctions were going to hurt the people more than help. That the people at a certain echelon, whether it's the highest echelon or wherever, were going to benefit, but the real people, the people of the country, the people of that part of the world, were the ones that were going to be impacted, and it was going to be painful, it was going to be setback, it was going to be harmful. And once again, it was because of the human element that he never lost sight of.
Cameron, building on that, but you also are mentioning with President Trump, and you served for Obama. Do you think, though, Obama did something different with the military in the sense that we having our first black commander-in-chief, and that people of black Americans were saying in the military were feeling something special about that? Did you encounter that in any real way?
I didn't personally, and I think when you go through basic training or boot camp, you're all beat down together, right? So it creates this. I mean, you're all treated equally as bad, right? So it's there's not a race thing really in the military, and I know it's a big point. A lot of people want to talk about, but honest to God, one of my best friends, he was black, he was a Ranger, right? And it's like that when you go through that together, it doesn't really matter. So, in terms of the president being black and how that affected active duty service members, I didn't see it affected in any way. I think if anything, as a whole, operations just changed, right? It just kind of pushed things into the shadow, right, for probably PR reasons or whatever, but operations didn't slow down. You know, the enemy death toll did not slow down. The tactics to kill the enemy were a little bit different, right? A lot of drone strikes and stuff like that, but that was really the only change I saw.
Lisa, what do we all need to do more? Because I was mentioning taking our shuttle bus over here. I was hoping to do something with, to start doing some of my history teaching to people in the military more. But sometimes I feel like we don't do enough to, we say we love the troops, we say we do fund the military, but how do we, as citizens, get more emotionally involved with what's at stake? We're in a dangerous world right now, and people are putting their lives in harm's way. Are we too isolated from the realities of military life, or what's being asked of us as American people?
I think sometimes we take for granted our military, that they serve and they're over there and they're doing their thing, and we don't really think about what's behind it all and their families at home. I mean, my dad wasn't lifetime military. My dad just served his time and came home. But we always had respect. We always understood what they were fighting for. We're fighting, for democracy. We are protecting, always should be protecting our country against dictatorships or any kind of, taking away of any kind of rights. So I really just think we need to read our history, World War II history, and all our war histories. But World War II incorporates so many countries. I'm reading a book now about Poland, in what the underground in Poland and Belgium and Norway, and what they did during the war. This was a true group effort, and I really think that we need to understand truly what we were fighting for. Not just, of course, against the evil access or whatever, but more about human rights and democracy and freedom, the freedom to be who you want. I mean, my dad was a first-generation American, and I can remember being 18, the vote changed, we could now vote at 18. My dad was there after school picking me up so that I could go register to vote. So you need all that. We just need to teach our children how important it is. And that saying says, if you forget your history, you have to learn from your history, or you are destined to repeat it. Yeah.
We only have a few minutes to go. That's a great answer, though. And you know who we also often underappreciate? Groups like the 40th Infantry Band and California National Guard. Thank you guys for being here for us. It's amazing what the music does to lift the spirit and frame our minds and souls, and so thank you. We're going to do one round, last questions. It's about America today. We'll start with you. What's your biggest concern about what's going on in U.S. foreign policy, military affairs? What's keeping you up at night that you think maybe it's a larger threat to our democracy than we realize?
Good question. I've always been an advocate for how you got something is how you keep it, right? So America's fallen into this retirement mindset, if you will, of work hard, stack money, and then chill out for 20 years, right? Or go do something, we're good, we don't have to worry about it anymore, and that freedom's there. So like in this instance, go out, establish our freedom, liberate Europe, do our thing, establish ourselves as the free world, the leading country, and then kick our feet up. So my fear is we're crippled by comfort right now, and we're in that phase. What the old saying I think is like, hard times creates, hard times creates rough men, or rough men create easy times, easy times create soft men create hard times, right? Something like that. I probably butchered it, but we're kind of in that phase of soft men, right? We went through hard times, and we're kind of on that tail end where I hate to say it, but something is inevitably going to happen, right? It's just that's the circle of how things work. So it's tough, you know. And as somebody that fought, you know, I don't want to see anything happen. I want to come back and kick my feet up. So yeah, that's why I make it a driving point to, you know, be a good American, right? Because I think that's what we're lacking. You know, the media likes to focus on this very, very small percentage of bad Americans that are yapping at the college campuses and doing all that, when in actuality, this is America, right? So we need to be louder. And I think if we do that, right, we do a good job of being a little bit louder, not only does it show our allies that we are still strong, it shows our enemies that we're not, you know, we're still not a country to mess with. So that's where I guess my heart is right now and what I'm seeing. Granted, I'm a young guy. I've only lived through, you know, 1, maybe 2 conflicts, but just studying the history books, you know, that's a pretty big concern of mine right now.
Excellent. And would you ever consider going into politics yourself?
My wife might kill me.
Yeah, I think you'd be great. You're a wonderful public servant.
I appreciate that.
Same question to you. What's concerning you?
I just say, please vote. Vote your heart. Get out and vote. Vote for democracy.
Do you feel that that's the gateway for future America? Even if you're doing a write-in on your ballot, or even if you're picking a third-party candidate, you'd rather see them vote than stay home?
I think, well, you should. Everybody should vote, and that's the beauty of our country. We have a democracy, so that we can all, our voices all can be heard. I feel personally democracy is in jeopardy. And so I feel you need to get out there and vote.
Yeah. Very good.
I'm looking at the clock here, so I'm only going to take a minute.
All right, that's it.
Two things. I'm going to answer that, but I want to go back to Omaha Beach real quick. That day before Reagan spoke at Omaha Beach, historic photos, historic footage of the Reagans going into the cemetery, and Nancy placing the flowers on the grave. And after that, we had it scheduled for the President and Mrs. Reagan to go into the small chapel, which is in the back corner of the American Cemetery at Omaha Beach, just a tiny little chapel. They were going to go in there, say a prayer very briefly, and then go out and give the address. And the photo went well, as Charlie Backley knows, and the footage, it was all there. And when we went to go into the chapel, the door was locked. We had the director of the American Cemetery who'd been with us all those weeks and everything. And I said, "Can you unlock the door?" And he said, "I don't have the key." And I said, "What do you mean you don't have the key?" He said, "Well, I gave it to the Secret Service, the technical division of the Secret Service that goes in and does the security sweep. What they did was they secured it, they swept it like they did the cemetery. They locked it, kept the key, didn't give it back. There's the president standing there, Nancy standing there, and everybody's looking at like, what are you gonna do?" And I said, "We're not going in, you know." And so I said, "Why don't we just wait here a little bit and just let the time go by, just a few minutes and everything." And then the day the address went on and everything was perfection. But the next day, flying home, we're headed back to Washington, flying back commercially. was reading the International Herald Tribune, and that was was owned by the Washington Post, the New York Times, and I think Whitney Communications, and had all the stories, had all the photos, and talked about everything, the day, the quotes from Reagan's speeches, and everything. And then it had that little bit in there about, and the Reagans, the President and Mrs. Reagan went into the chapel and prayed at Omaha Beach. And I put the paper down, I just said, it sounds pretty good to me. Now, to answer your question.
We are out of time, but did you had to tell Mrs. Reagan she couldn't go in? I would not want to be in that position.
Well, yeah. And I looked at Reagan like, hey, I went to the president, help me out here, like.
Did you think of kicking it with your, ramming it open?
Can we take the hinges off or something and open it the other way? Doug, I just want to say real quick, what bothers me is people complain about Congressman so-and-so, Congresswoman so-and-so, Senator such and such, the president, the former president, or whatever. It's not the office holders. It's not the Congress. It's not the representatives. It's not the senators. It's not the president. It's not the person running for president. It's the electorate. And it just drives me crazy. The electorate needs to get more informed before they go in and vote. And they're the ones that empower these people. It's not the people running for it, it's the electorate.
What an incredible panel we've had. Cameron and Lisa James, stellar. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the program is about to resume. Please take your seats and turn off all electronic devices. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the program is about to resume. Please take your seats and turn off all electronic devices. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the program is about to resume. Please take your seats and turn off all electronic devices. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the program is about to resume. Please take your seats and turn off all electronic devices. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Trulio, President and CEO of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Please take your seats if you haven't had a chance. I know that it's been a tremendous morning so far, and we're going to keep that momentum going. As you heard a moment ago, my name is David Trulio, and it is my privilege to be the President and CEO of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Our foundation trustee, Ted Olson, could not be with us here today, so it is my privilege to introduce the next panel. So on this very day in 1984 in Normandy, President Reagan said the following words in front of D-Day veterans, quote, "The men of Normandy had faith that what they were doing was right, faith that they fought for all humanity, faith that a just God would grant them mercy on this beachhead and on the next." President Reagan continued, "It was the deep knowledge, and pray God we have not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest. You were here to liberate, not to conquer. And so you and those others did not doubt your cause. And you were right not to doubt." Unquote. The distinction President Reagan drew between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest is one that was important not just on D-Day, but also for the Reagan presidency and beyond. President Reagan hated war. He wanted to prevent war. And in the event he ever had to use force, it would be to advance freedom and not to conquer. President Reagan sought peace, and he understood that peace requires strength. It is strength that tyrants respect. It is strength that enemies understand. It is strength that keeps the peace. As a guiding philosophy, peace through strength is as relevant today as it was 40 years ago. And our next panel focuses on where we need our leaders to rediscover and recommit to that philosophy. The Wall Street Journal's Kate Bachelder Odell will moderate a conversation with former U.S. Ambassador to Germany, Richard Burt, who was with Ronald Reagan in Normandy, Frank Lavin, who served as Ronald Reagan's White House Director of Political Affairs and later served as ambassador to Singapore under President George W. Bush, and Dr. Matt Kroenig, who is Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and a Georgetown professor. Please welcome them to the stage.
Well, good morning. It's truly an honor to be here today and be included in these conversations. My name's Kate Odell, and I'm here with our esteemed panelists, and we have the humble task of looking at the world today and thinking about how peace through strength should influence it. And I think Fred, in his opening remarks, really captured some of the essential questions about whether the U.S. has the national courage and the will to meet the challenges currently facing through another difficult moment. So we're going to try to talk about both the Cold War and D-Day as a lens to look at the world today. So I thought I would start by going down the line and asking our guests here, what does peace through strength really mean? We hear it repeated by Republicans all through campaigns. It's a Republican belief, but what would you distill the national, the essential elements of peace through strength? So I want to start with Matthew because he's just written a book that has really tackled this question. I recommend it to all. We win, they lose. And so Matthew, why don't you open us up and talk about what peace through strength means, and then we'll allow Frank and Rich a chance to get in on that question.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, and it's a great honor to be here. And as was mentioned, I just published a book called We Win, They Lose, Republican Foreign Policy in the New Cold War. And of course, We Win, They Lose was Reagan's statement about his strategy for the first Cold War. And I argue that as we enter this new period of strategic competition, that would also be a good goal for this new Cold War. So I hope we can talk about We Win, They Lose later. But peace through strength was one of Reagan's mantras. And essentially, it's the idea that the United States should be so strong that no adversary dare challenge us. So it is, the purpose is peace, it's deterrence. But I think it also means that if you are challenged, you're willing to punch back. And we saw that Reagan, for example, when the Iranians mined the Persian Gulf and struck a US warship, Reagan was willing to strike back, sinking several Iranian vessels. I think we've seen that other administrations have gone wrong when they don't follow peace through strength. So I think the peace through strength point of view is skeptical of kind of long, drawn-out nation-building campaigns using military force for that purpose. And I also think that it's different from the current Biden approach, which I think is excessively cautious, worried about escalation with the Russians, worried about escalation with Iran. And maybe something we can discuss. I actually do think that there is a consensus still within the Republican Party that peace through strength is the right approach, and Trump and many other Republican candidates often use that phrase. So I think that is where the party is still today.
Frank, let's go to you. Please.
Frank. Thank you, Kate, for holding us together. Thank you, Fred and David, and a wonderful day we have here today. Reagan inherited a geopolitical competition. And as Matt, I think so aptly put it, we were in it to win it, that we weren't there to survive or endure, but we're in there to prevail. And I think that hard power was an important part of that effort, and I think coalition management was an important part of that effort. But I also think there were other elements that he excelled at, one of which was communications and the moral dimension of foreign policy, that we were in it to win it, not just because we were rivals, but because the U.S. system was based on individual liberty and respect for human freedom and the democratic way of life, and the Soviet system was repressive. So we had an important moral rationale for our efforts, and we also wanted to communicate that. We wanted to win friends and allies and like-minded people through messaging, that we thought the free people of the world should be sympathetic and supportive of the U.S.-led efforts. And Reagan took that role very seriously. So all of that contributed to peace through strength as well.
Richard, please.
Thank you, Kate. I don't disagree with these two statements that have just been made, but I would argue that Reagan thought of peace through strength in a more, I think, a broader and more comprehensive way. It wasn't only military power. Military power was important, and he wasn't afraid to use it. You mentioned the Iranian confrontation at sea. I remember very clearly serving in Germany when the Libyans blew up a discotheque in Berlin, killing American troops there. Very quickly, Reagan dispatched the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy carrier-based aircraft and F-111s based in Lakenheath in Britain, and bombed Tripoli, killing one of Gaddafi's daughters in the process. And you didn't hear from Muammar Gaddafi for a good long time. So he wasn't afraid to do that, but he had a broader conceptual understanding. He knew that it included a political component, a diplomatic component, and Frank, you may want to talk in a few minutes about the economic component. And this is important because while I think he understood that the United States had to confront its adversaries first and foremost, as we heard earlier this morning, talking about what happened the 40th anniversary in Normandy, he understood the crucial role that alliance management played in American strategy. So he strengthened and expanded our alliance relationships in Europe and in Asia and the Middle East, the three principal theaters. He also, after he had substantially enhanced our military capabilities and exercised political leadership, he engaged in diplomacy, and that was part of strength as well. He not only didn't want war, but he was prepared to enter into agreements to make it less likely. So it's important to recognize that peace through strength means not only a comprehensive view of military, political, and economic power, the importance of alliance, the importance of deterrence, and finally, the importance of diplomacy, because it was, in fact, the Reykjavik meetings, the 1987 INF Treaty, which totally eliminated a whole category of nuclear weapons, and finally, his communication skills, saying in Berlin in 1987, tear down this wall, so in 1989, in fact, it came down.
Thanks, Richard. Well, a little thought exercise here to paint a picture of the world. So, inflation's running hot. American society is restive and divided. There is a public sense that perhaps the country's best days are behind it. The U.S. recently withdrew in disgrace from one of the longest wars in its history, and a communist superpower appears ascendant and is building up military force at a ferocious pace. Of course, the world I'm trying to describe is not today. It's the world Ronald Reagan inherited in 1981.
Exactly right.
So I want to ask Matthew first, what parallels are there from the Cold War to the current moment? Are we in a new Cold War with the Chinese Communist Party? And what similarities or core differences do we need to think about?
Yeah, well, good question, and I think there are a lot of similarities. So when Reagan came to office, there was a lot of pessimism, the feeling that the United States was in decline, a sense that the Soviet Union was maybe the rising power, that the best approach was to manage the competition through détente, kind of lock in parity through a series of arms control agreements. And Reagan didn't believe it. He thought that that painted an unacceptable moral equivalence between the United States and its free world allies and the totalitarian Soviet Union and its captive nations on the other hand. But he also thought that we had strengths and they had real weaknesses, and if we took the gloves off and forced them to compete, we could prevail, and he was essentially right. Many criticized him at the time, but by the time he left office, he'd essentially won the first Cold War. So I think we're in a similar place now. Many people think the United States is in decline. China is this serious competitor. And the Biden administration has said that their goal for the competition with China is to responsibly manage the competition. And I think that's wrong. I think we should take a page out of Reagan's playbook and compete. And I do think that the United States and its allies are stronger than China and the revisionist autocracies it's working with. Just a couple of data points. The United States is not a declining power. If you look at the numbers, we're a rising power. 26% of global GDP right now. It's our highest share in the past 2 decades. Our alliances, more than 30 formal treaty allies. Finland and Sweden just joined the alliance. So together, we have something like 60% of global GDP, taking the NATO allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, compared to 18% of global GDP or so for China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. So I think we are in a stronger position. I still think we have the moral high ground. The ideas of freedom from the Reagan era still work. And so again, I think we should try to win, not just manage the competition.
Richard, I want to get your thoughts on the same question. Are we in a new Cold War, and what can we take from the last one?
I don't know if I like that question, because I think it simplifies maybe to too big a degree the kind of complexity of our current international situation. I don't think it's less dangerous, so there I certainly agree that it's a dangerous and complicated world. But you know, during the Reagan era and prior to that, thanks largely to another president, President Nixon, and his Secretary of State, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, we were in a very interesting geopolitical situation. During our time in the 1980s, as Henry Kissinger used to say, we had better ties with Moscow than Moscow had with China, and we had better ties with China than China had with Moscow. That is not the reality today. The two leaders of China and Russia call it a relationship, a partnership without limits. So we've got a Chinese-Russian condominium, which I find very, very dangerous, and I don't know how we can pry it apart in the near term. We also face a very serious challenge in the Middle East in terms of Iran. Now, there may be some opportunities there given recent developments there, but it's dangerous. And then, of course, you've got the kind of crazy state, wild, random variable of North Korea. So it's a difficult situation. But in the end, I completely agree that we have the necessary economic strength, potential allies in Asia, Europe, and elsewhere to be able to compete effectively. But there are two factors that are going to be critical, and this goes to your question. One is, do we have a sense of optimism of the sort that Ronald Reagan brought to politics? When we talked yesterday about mourning in America, I'm not hearing that now. I'm not hearing mourning in America. I'm hearing political politicians tearing America down, calling it a hellhole, rather than being optimistic and confident about what we can achieve. And finally, maybe our biggest problem is not China, it's not an aggressive Russia, maybe it's our own political cohesion, or more importantly, the lack of it. Because I happen to believe, honestly, that perhaps the greatest source of international instability, given our size, given our strength, and given our global role, is what's going to happen to America in the next 10 years.
Frank, why don't you weigh in on the same question, and perhaps drawing on your experience in Asia, talk a little bit about the economic element. Reagan was a dedicated free trader his entire political career. What is our economic posture in Asia right now? How is it contributing to this competition?
Thanks. Look, Ronald Reagan, I think, always understood that economic success was an important building block to foreign policy. For one, you need to have the political support in a democracy for what you're trying to do, and that as long as the economy is performing and jobs are being created, the general public would tend to give you the benefit of the doubt for your other initiatives. But that was an important requirement for political leadership, was let's get the economy growing. And Reagan was very successful in that regard. You also need to pay for what you're doing. So you better have a growing economy that will allow you to undertake the activities you need to undertake. So those are important building blocks. And then, Kate, as you just alluded to, Reagan believed in trade liberalization. That it helped the U.S. economy, but it also was a mechanism for connecting with like-minded nations. And everybody in the world has a different appetite for liberalization, a different political system for liberalization, but let's work with those who we want to work with. And strategically, let's work in North America. So Reagan first articulated North American Accord to say, can we come to some kind of economic arrangement with Canada and Mexico that will liberalize and allow us to improve. Reagan also pursued other trade agreements as well. And that was generally viewed at the time as a huge boon to the U.S. economy. In my view, that's an accurate assessment. But it's much more controversial today to say trade is a good and we need to be protectionist and we need to raise tariffs and we need to watch out and the world is out to get us and we can't really make friends or have relationships. And what's extraordinary is China, which to my mind is not diplomatically agile, but China has shown greater appetite for trade liberalization with its neighbors than the U.S. has. So U.S. has pulled back from some of these trade relationships, and China said, we'll take up the slack. So I could tell you there is not a country in East Asia that is happier to see more of a China presence in its economy. There's not a person in East Asia who wakes up and says, I sure hope our country's closer to China. But China's there, and we're not there. So China's a fact of life, and we've said we don't want to be a fact of life. Now, I think we're short-selling ourselves by doing that, but that's sort of where the mood is in America today.
Richard, did you have something to add?
I just want to completely agree with Frank. I mean, he's made some very important points here. And having witnessed what happened in this audience yesterday, I can say something because it's not a question of whether I'm going to criticize the Democrats or criticize the Republicans, because I'm going to criticize them both. I think that our international economic strategy of both parties is really, really crappy. If you look at the Democrats, what you've seen in the Biden administration is adopt industrial policy. What they're doing with whether it's the CHIPS Act or the IRA, you name it, what we're doing is subsidizing and picking winners and losers. And I can't think of a situation where that's worked in the past. Certainly would have never happened in the Reagan administration. But then turning attention to the Republicans, they're becoming populists. They're becoming populists. They're playing to the audience. They're not. They're talking about tariffs, imposing new tariffs when and if a Republican administration comes into power. Well, anybody who knows that anything knows about tariffs. That's a tax on people. That reduces trade. It doesn't build trade. It creates more inflation, and it lowers people's income. And so I think both parties are playing to the cheap seats, as they say. They're not thinking about the way Reagan did of how to create wealth. All we're doing is talking about is how to shift it around. And that's not how you build strong, dynamic, competitive economies.
Could I add a note
Please,
on this? And Reagan was right that free trade works in general, but there are exceptions, and I suspect my colleagues would agree with me, but look forward to hearing otherwise. But trading with adversaries doesn't necessarily make sense. There's always been a national security exception. Reagan could have made money selling nuclear weapons to the Soviet Union, but we didn't do that for obvious reasons. And so today with China, I do think a different approach is needed. For decades after the end of the Cold War, we'd hoped that by trading with China, they'd become wealthier. As they become wealthier, they'd become more democratic. As they became more democratic, they'd become more cooperative. And instead, that hasn't worked. Instead, Xi's gone in the other direction, becoming more oppressive at home, more aggressive internationally. And so I do think the Trump administration deserves credit for getting tough with China, and the Biden administration, to their credit, has largely kept that in place. And I think essentially we need a three-part strategy for thinking about economic relations with China. One, in sensitive national security areas, I do think we need a hard decoupling. And just one story to show how bad it's gotten. There was an article in the Washington Post about a year ago about a Silicon Valley technology company that was developing software that would simulate a wind tunnel that the Department of Defense could use to test hypersonic weapons before, instead of building the weapon and putting it in a real wind tunnel, they could simulate it. But it's a private company. They applied to the Commerce Department for an export license to sell this technology to China, and it was approved. So presumably China is building hypersonic missiles now to kill Americans, built by an American. So that kind of thing doesn't make sense. Second, there are areas where it's not a national security issue, but China is cheating, stealing intellectual property. And in those areas, I do think countervailing measures like tariffs make sense. But then third and finally, I think even with China, there are areas where free trade can and should continue. If they want to buy soybeans, if we want to buy cheap made-in-China T-shirts, I think that is fine. So I think that there are exceptions to Reagan's free trade approach.
Frank, I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah. By the way, I don't think I disagree with anything Matt said, but I just would add to it, meaning you shouldn't have a trade policy that's 100% stick. Meaning you shouldn't have a trade policy that says, here's what I don't like about the world today, and I'm going to have policies that punish things I don't like. That's my view of the world. What you should do, what Ronald Reagan did, so yeah, all that exists, and we should have a strategy with problems in the world today that is stick-oriented. But we have to say there are a lot of nations that want to engage with us on trade on a rules-based trade. There are a lot of friendly nations out there. So you could do it two different ways. You could say, I'm going to increase tariff on hostile nations 10%. Maybe you should. Or you could say, we should decrease tariffs on friendly nations 10%. Maybe you should. But the first one punishes the U.S. The first one adds to U.S. inflation, adds to U.S. cost of goods, has U.S. steel producers raise their prices. The second one helps the U.S. economy. Now, both of them functionally do the same thing. Both of them make China less competitive, right? But one does so that is more carrot-based, one does so most stick-based. Or you could do a combination. So what I think is frustrating for me as someone who believes in trade and economic growth is to say, boy, our entire rhetoric is 100% stick-based, 100% what don't we like in the world today, and let's go tackle what we don't like. And that should not be 100% of what we do.
So a couple points that I completely agree with. One that Richard made here is that peace through strength represents a lot more than just military power. But I do think military power is a core part of the conversation, and it also informs how much of this selective decoupling we need to do with China. So I do want to ask and discuss, the U.S. is spending about 3% of its economy on national defense right now, and we're floating into territories that approach the 1930s. And when we look at Reagan's Pointy Hawk speech, he describes the bitter lessons of 2 world wars, which is that we can't take blind shelter across the sea. And sometimes wars represent free societies that have not taken the necessary preparations to defend themselves. So I guess, Richard, we'll go to you first on this, but the U.S. was closer to 6% of its economy on defense during the peak of the Cold War. Does the U.S. need to get back to an adequate military deterrent of that size, and can it be done?
In my view, the answer is yes. I'm a real hawk on defense spending. And one thing we forget, and this some people make the point, and I think it's correct, that with the end of the Cold War, we historically went on a kind of vacation. And I say we, I not only talk about the United States, but we and our allies, both in Europe and Asia. And so if you look at everybody's defense spending, it declined through the 90s and into the 21st century. And we need to all get back to sort of 4% plus. And what the Ukrainian conflict for me has really been underscored is how we've let our defense industrial base atrophy. So it's just not a question of buying sort of gold-plated weapons, new naval platforms, new strategic bombers, a new generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and so on. But we have run short, as those of you who follow the Ukrainian war, in something as mundane as 155 millimeter shells for artillery. We literally, and I say we again, I'm speaking about the alliance, we can't produce them fast enough. We have to source them from all over the world. So we, and I'm again talking about we and our allies, need to spend more, and we need to spend more on defense industry if we're going to be competitive and be able to exercise a strategy of forward defense and extended deterrence. One little footnote, I'm in the Reagan era and all through that Cold War period, we talked about a 2.5 war strategy. We said we needed an armed forces capable, we and our allies, be able to fight a major war in Europe, a major war in Asia, and a half war somewhere else, i.e. like the Middle East. We haven't talked about that for nearly 40 years. And we ought to bring that back as a strategy that is well funded to implement.
I'll follow up on that with Matthew. I think there is polling. The Reagan Institute does periodic polling on how Americans view America's role in the world, and there does seem to be public support for more defense spending, but there is also criticism about Pentagon acquisition failures, other embarrassments of that variety. And so I wanted to ask you, Matthew, about building the public case for that. I went back and looked at one of Reagan's speeches in 1983, where he really takes an extended amount of time to convince the public to go along with his defense increases and why they were necessary, and to say that behind these budget numbers is something fundamental, which is our ability to prevent the greatest of all human tragedies. So I guess my question to you is how would a smart Republican start a movement of that effort to persuade the public to go along with these expensive, large increases in investment in our defense?
Good. Well, I'll respond with 2 points. First, talking about how to sway public opinion, and then two, I would like to come back to some of Ambassador Burt's points about a two-war four-sizing construct. So I have a PhD in political science, and one thing political scientists think they know is that it doesn't really make sense to talk about a public opinion on foreign and defense policy because people are busy, they're going about their daily lives, they know they're not experts on the latest developments in the Donbass or whatever. And so often public opinion reflects the opinion of their leaders. They're looking to their leaders in Washington, what are they saying? And so I think the answer is leadership. And I think this is a place where we've fallen down recently. When is the last time a US president stood up and made the case of here's what's going on in the world, here's my strategy to address it, I need the resources to do it, please support me. But I think if the next president did that, he could bring the American public along. So I think that's the answer, not responding to what you think public opinion is, but leading and bringing the public with you. And then on the two-war, I mean, in a way, the security environment we face now is even more difficult than during the Cold War. With China's massive nuclear buildup, for the first time in US history, we'll have to face two near-peer nuclear superpowers at the same time, which is something that we didn't have to do even during the Cold War. And so I was fortunate recently to be appointed by Congress to a commission to review US strategic forces policy, and we delivered our report to Congress in October. We had bad timing. It was a few days after the October 7th attack, so it didn't get much attention. But we essentially called for the first US strategic forces buildup since Reagan's time, and said that we need to plan to buy more nuclear submarines, more strategic bombers, upload ICBMs, build a missile defense system for the first time to deal with Russia and China. Past US policy has been that our missile defenses are only going to be for rogue states like Iran and North Korea. We recommended that we have a system also for China and Russia, not a perfect shield, which would be impossible, but at least a limited defense. And so I think here again are some of Reagan's ideas that are still relevant. He, of course, was a big believer in missile defense, a big believer in having a strong strategic force. And so I think that's going to be an important part of the strategy, along with increasing defense spending. And I saw Wicker and the Senate called for the United States to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, again, more closer to the Reagan levels. So I think those are some of the pieces: increasing defense spending, strategic deterrence. And then finally, allies also do need to do more. And this isn't just a Trump complaint. If you look at NATO, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, came out with really the first serious plans for defending Europe since the end of the Cold War. Regional plans, they were approved at the summit last year. And all NATO countries have promised they'll spend at least 2% of GDP. But the experts who've looked at these regional plans say actually to get there, every NATO country is going to have to spend something like 3.7% of GDP. And so we're nowhere close. The Canadians, the Western Europeans, the Canadians, the Western Europeans are going to have to meet those spending targets if we're going to have an effective defense of Europe.
Well, maybe I'll ask Richard to follow up on that. Everybody agrees that our European allies should spend more on their own defense. There are disagreements about what is an effective way to do that, and perhaps not much appreciation that we did set up a system that would allow America to be the preeminent military power in that alliance. So what do you think are effective ways to encourage our allies to step up and make these defense spending commitments?
Well, to some extent, Vladimir Putin has helped in a big way, and you've had the so-called Zeitenwende in Germany. Now, that's been a little bit, I have to say, a disappointment. The German government has not moved as quickly as I hoped they would, but there is a process, I think, of a realization on the part of the Germans that they need, because remember, we forget, they are now the world's third largest economy. And so they have to take the lead. And one of the ways the Germans take the lead is together with the French. tends to be the motor for Europe. So number one, I think the Germans have to get their act together. They're partially there, and they're not all the way there. The French have to join in that effort. They're not doing enough. The European frontline states are doing very well. Poland is the leader, I would argue, of that group, of the Balts, the Romanians and others. They feel the chilly air from Ukraine and from the Russians, so they're moving ahead. But I have to tell you, you don't get, in my experience, because prior to going to Germany, I was the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe under Ronald Reagan. You don't get the Europeans, or I would say the Asian allies, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and others like the Australians and people like and Taiwan. You don't get them to do more by threatening, the U.S. threatening to do less. What you get instead is people start to hedge. And by hedging, I mean, if you see the United States withdraw from NATO, for example, you're likely to see countries thinking about either they're going to move closer to Russia or they're going to think about acquiring their own nuclear deterrent. And you think the world would be safe with maybe 20 or 25 nuclear powers, many of them former American allies, you're wrong. It's a lot more dangerous. So our allies are going to do more if we act as good allies and we do more, because that's what happened under Ronald Reagan, and I think it could happen again.
Frank, I'll ask you a similar question about our Asia-Pacific presence. The Biden administration has not increased defense spending, has proposed a real cut in defense every year in office, but it has undertaken some efforts expanding our bases in the Philippines, the AUKUS deal to sell the Australian submarines. These seem like good developments. How do you rate that Pacific diplomacy and the current state of our Pacific posture?
I think Rick's point and Matt's point, hard power is an important component of this, and we're behind where we need to be. But I think there's also a diplomatic element, and you alluded to some of it, Kate. I'd love to see us improve our operations, our exercise schedule with the Philippines, which would be a very strong statement. I'd like to see a stronger freedom of navigation tempo in the South China Sea, and let's invite many NATO countries already participate in that, but let's broaden that. Canada's been very active in the South China Sea, so let's look at a free trade agreement with Taiwan. So there's things we can do, there's steps we can take, and if you really want to deflect China, I had meetings with the EU 2 weeks ago, and I said, what % of the German auto market is going to be Chinese in the next 3 years? And what employment is going to shrink in the German auto production because of Chinese EV imports in the next 3 years? But I said, what I'd like to see is a US-EU accord on autos. That basically any auto made in Europe, legally sold in Europe, can be legally sold in the US and vice versa, right? But just bringing efficiencies to our auto sectors would be a deflection of Chinese inroads, would disempower China, and would be a very strong signal to China that you folks aren't playing by the rules, and we're going to work with people who are playing by the rules. So we need to be a little agile on our diplomacy ourselves. I give Trump and Biden credit for the Quad and reinvigorating, elevating the Quad to a leader's list. I think that was great. I think AUKUS was a great step ahead. So there's been some nice steps ahead in the region, but China is on a trajectory that is, they want to outpace us. And they want to have the ultimate say in determining architecture in Asia. And if we're asleep, we'll let that happen.
Well, I want to make sure we anchor this conversation in D-Day and here to remember it. So looking again at Reagan's speech at Pointe du Hoc, he makes a very categorical statement near the end that I'll read to you. We've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent. Now, I think Reagan chose his words carefully, and I have to read that as a marker intended to signal something to future generations like us as we try to solve the current world problems. So I want to go to Matthew and ask, some today, perhaps on the right, would argue would eschew the term isolationist, that they simply have more realistic goals about what America can accomplish for the world. Can you weigh in on to what extent is there an isolationist current growing in American public opinion?
Well, first, I agree with Reagan that I think American engagement in the world has been good for the world and good for the United States. And if you look at when the United States was isolationist before World War II, what was the result? 2 world wars, a Great Depression. After World War II, the United States was finally willing to step up and play this international leadership role. And sometimes this period of U.S. leadership hasn't been perfect. We've made mistakes, but I think it's been the best system ever envisioned for global order. And if you just look at the data, 0 great power wars in 70 years. Standard of living, the average American is 5 times wealthier today than they were in 1945. And freedom around the world. There were only about 12 democracies in the world in 1945. Now there are nearly 100. And so the world is safer, richer, and freer today because of American power and engagement. And the American people, the average American is safer, richer, and freer today because of that. So staying engaged makes sense. I think there is an isolationist sentiment. You have people saying, why do we care about Ukraine? Why do we care about their borders? We can't deal with our borders. You have others saying, well, we have to focus on China, so we can't deal with Europe anymore. Europe's going to have to do Europe, we'll do Asia. I don't think that makes sense. I think the United States has global interest, and we need to stay engaged to address them. My sense, though, and I'd welcome my panelists' thoughts on this, is there's always been this strain in the United States and the Republican Party before some of the isolationists today. We've had Rand Paul for a while, who's always been more skeptical. So I think it's larger today, but I do think the majority of the party and the country still understand that American engagement's important. If you look at the leadership in Congress, Mitch McConnell, Speaker Johnson, even, I think they understand that the United States has an important role to play in the world.
Richard, Frank, do you want to jump in on that?
Well, I mean, very, very briefly, I couldn't disagree with a single word that Matt said about what America has achieved by a strategy focused on forward deployment and global engagement. And there has been historically a strain in some quarters in American politics, some on the far right, some on the far left. We saw the far left in the early 70s. Now we're living through a period where the far right sort of is embracing America alone, America first idea. But I think there remains a moderate center in American politics, but it really does require leadership. It needs presidential communications and leadership, and you need somebody like a Ronald Reagan to mobilize that sentiment.
I want to turn now just briefly to the war in Ukraine, that we can discuss how firmly is the U.S. support for Ukraine rooted in the Reagan doctrine, and more broadly, given the situation we have in Ukraine, Putin has not let up on his aims, has opened a new front in the country's north. What is the path to prevailing in that conflict and ending it on terms favorable to the United States? We'll start with Matthew on that, but I would love to get multiple views.
Well, I think 2 years ago at the start of the war, many Reaganites were saying, answer is clear, give Ukraine everything it needs to win decisively on the battlefield and take back all of its territory. Unfortunately, that's not what the Biden administration has done. I think they've, talking about leadership, Biden didn't stand up in the first days of the war and say, here are the stakes, here's my strategy, please support me. And we've been very indecisive in terms of how we provide weapons. He was against providing tanks, and then he was for it. He was against providing aircraft, and then he was for it. He was against providing these ATACMS, then he was for it. He was against Ukraine using weapons on Russian territory, now he's for it. And they've been fearful of Russian escalation, and I think there's a healthy aspect to that. Russia is a major nuclear power. We don't want to fight a nuclear war over this. But in my opinion, they've been a little bit too cautious, afraid that, because Putin's in a difficult situation right now. He doesn't want a war with NATO. He doesn't want a nuclear war either. And I think we sometimes forget that he's also afraid of nuclear war. So since we didn't have that robust strategy at the beginning, I think things are starting to bog down now. The Russians have had time to dig in behind Dragon's Teeth and other things. I think new technology like drones for intelligence and surveillance and also for strikes against tanks may give defense the advantage. So what the Biden administration is saying is that they envision an 18-month strategy where Ukraine goes on defense for this summer, and then in the summer of 2025 go on a new counteroffensive. The Senate could say, well, is this an effort to stabilize things before the election and then push it off? But I do wonder, since we haven't given the Ukraine the weapons they need to win, do we need to start thinking about what does it look like if the lines stabilize along the current line of contact, and is there some strategy then to bring in West Ukraine into NATO, into the EU, kind of like we did with West Germany after World War II, and then is there some kind of longer-term diplomatic strategy to bring the rest of Ukraine into the West?
Richard, do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think I generally agree. I think Matt's a little bit too tough on the Biden administration. You've got to remember that Ukraine was a component part of the Soviet Union. You've also got to remember that Putin himself could be viewed in his invasion of Ukraine as acting a little bit irrationally and wondering about whether, if he views this as part of Russian territory, whether use of American military power on Russian territory might lead, as their own nuclear doctrine says, to a nuclear response. In these sorts of situations, when you're dealing with a country with thousands of nuclear weapons, a certain amount of prudence is necessary. So, it's easy in retrospect to say, gee, we should have done more because Putin hasn't used nuclear weapons, but we don't know how, and under other situations, how he might have reacted. But I generally agree with the way Matt described the scenario. I also believe that the likelihood of an all-out all-out Ukrainian victory at this point is very, very low. And so I think in the near term, what we've got to think through is how do we position the Ukrainians? When I say we, not just the United States, but our European allies, how do we give them a chance to be able to go into a possible negotiation in a year or so with the strongest possible negotiating hand? And I think we may have to look at this, Matt pointed out, maybe we do have to think about this as similar to the beginning of the Cold War, where we're not going to get, Ukraine isn't going to get all of its territory back right away. But if we are successful with a Western Ukraine that becomes economically dynamic, militarily able to defend itself with Allied help, as a member of the EU and potentially a member of NATO, that over time that Ukraine will finally get Crimea and the Donbass back. So that may be how we think about this. It's not going to happen in 1 year or 2 years, but it may be 10 years, we will prevail.
And I think Matt is really making a great point about perhaps some of the public frustration that we see is owed to more of the Biden administration's decisions. I think you say he's a little hard on them, but perhaps it is not as revealing as a fundamental shift away from supporting U.S. allies in a fight. And on that point, I wanted to ask Frank to opine a little bit, because there is some fundamental sense, though, in U.S. society that we are culturally too degraded, and that we have real problems at home. Years of chaos on the southern border has subsumed support for immigration. And I wanted to ask the Reagan mindset of thinking about our portfolio of problems and whether there's a dichotomy between our problems here and our problems abroad, and if that should influence us to pull back from the world, and how he thought about that.
Let me touch on that, and I think you're right. That's sort of where American politics is at the moment. I just want to put my 2 cents on Ukraine from a China lens, if I may. There's a reason why China is Putin's most important supporter. There's a reason why China is so aggressively funding and supporting and providing quote unquote non-military assistance to Russia. And China is in ascendancy. China is opportunistic and I think at times even predatory or malevolent. But China also has a view of a risk analysis, of cost-benefit analysis. And our goal as Americans, however this might end up, as Rick articulated, Matt suggests, however this might end up, I can tell you what we want out of China 6 months after Ukraine comes to an end. We want the next Politburo meeting, the next Central Committee meeting in Beijing. We want Xi Jinping to say to his lieutenant at lunch in Beijing, you know what? Putin is an idiot, isn't he? He blew it. He blew it. He didn't have to do this. He is reckless. He doesn't understand cost benefit. And his country paid a big, big price for his adventurism. In other words, we're not going to do that. We do not want to pay that kind of price on a bet that we can grab something, right? So this kind of smash and grab militarism is not rational, but which means whatever that ending is has to disempower the worst instincts in China, right? To have them say whatever we feel about Taiwan or other territories are near abroad, whatever we might feel in our heart of hearts about that, we better just hold off. We better just hold off for now, right? Because the U.S. is still intact, U.S. defense establishment is still intact, and these folks mean what they say. So that's what we want out of this through the Chinese lens. But boy, Kate, you raised a heck of an essay question about U.S. international commitment and U.S. domestic domestic obligations. And this argument is old as time itself. And I remember complaints on the U.S. space program that how can we put this kind of money to putting somebody on the moon when we have all these problems in the inner city? And we sure have problems in the inner city. We got bad schools and unemployment and even racial strife. And how can we have an Apollo project? But I would say, boy, that's really a false dichotomy. That there is, it's not amount of resources and spending that means we might have a school system in Baltimore that doesn't do what it should be doing. It's our own policy decisions. And it's not amount of resources that means we don't have good border control. It's our own policy decisions. We have bad policies. Every nation has the right to determine its borders. We have that right, and we're not acting on our own rights. So I'd say that's just a failure of the current administration, right? And it's nothing to do with our international posture or other obligations around the world.
Right. Well, we've run out of time quite quickly, faster than I expected, but I want to close out real quick. Thank you, yes. I want to close out with a very brief, 10 seconds perhaps, Richard, no pressure, but I do want to, I think there's an acute sense that people always think our problems are worse today than they've ever been in America, and I think Reagan really advocated that free societies can make changes, they can choose to go in a different direction. So a quick thought, leave us with a quick thought, what makes you optimistic that the US can overcome its challenges today?
I think that probably the most exciting thing about America today is The Economist magazine maybe 20 years ago did an article on the future of China and said, they noted that this country was a great future ahead of it. But they said if you really, and they called themselves the country of a permanent, the Chinese said they had a permanent revolution. The Economist, by the end of that article, concluded, no, the country that really has the permanent revolution is the United States. And you just look at the creativity in nearly every single field of activity. It flows out of the United States. And in the end, it's also related to the immigration problem. And one way or the other, we've got to find a solution to the immigration problem that does permit really ambitious and intelligent people to still be able to come to the United States and build things and do things that they can't do anywhere else on this planet. That's what makes me optimistic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. Yes.
Well, what a tremendous set of panels. As we've seen, commemorating the 80th anniversary of D-Day enables us to reflect upon the profound historical significance of that pivotal event, which exemplified unparalleled courage, strategic acumen, and the unwavering commitment of allies to the cause of freedom and democracy. As President Reagan noted 40 years ago, quote, "We in America have learned bitter lessons from 2 world wars. It is better to be here, ready to protect the peace, than to take blind shelter across the sea, rushing to respond only after freedom is lost." Then as now, peace through strength is an enduring principle of which we should all be mindful. So a very special thank you to each of our panelists and moderators for making today's program so special. I would like us to give one more round of applause, please, to all of our veterans, including our 4 World War II veterans. And the reason I jumped right up here is because it is now time to move to our Air Force One pavilion for lunch and our keynote fireside chat. Staff will help escort you to the pavilion. We are starting the program rather quickly, so please don't delay in your movement over to lunch. Thank you very much.